In this video, we will show you how to replace your driver's side front CV axle on this Jeep Grand Cherokee. This will be located behind your front wheel. Let's get into it. Okay friend, let's get started on our job. The first thing we need to do is safely raise and support the front of the vehicle so the wheel's off the ground. Once you've completed that, remove all 5 of your 22mm lug nuts and then the wheel. Now that we have the wheel out of the way, we're going to hold the rotor in place. You can do this using a spacer and one of your original lug nuts. Now we can continue on to our 32mm axle nut. A quick inspection, we'll set that aside. We'll use some penetrant in this area. Continue on with a hammer and punch directly in the center of your axle shaft. We're going to lightly tap on this, attempting to separate the axle shaft from the wheel bearing hub located just behind it. Once you can see movement from this area, you can continue on. Now let's start removing the outer tie rod end from our steering knuckle. This is held in place with a 21mm nut up along the top. Go ahead and remove that. We'll start it back on a couple threads. Typically, when you remove your outer tie rod end nut, the tie rod end stud will stick inside the knuckle. If that happens to you, you want to start the nut back on there a couple threads and then lightly tap on the steering knuckle, causing vibration, which will allow this to fall down. Once it has fallen down, go ahead and finish removing that nut and remove the outer tie rod end from the knuckle. A quick inspection of the tie rod end will continue on to the sway bar link. To start disconnecting the sway bar link from the lower control arm, we want to hold on to the shaft of the sway bar link, preventing it from spinning while we remove the 18mm headed mounting nut, which would be along the back side of that control arm. We'll just hold this with some locking pliers. We're going to be extremely careful not to cause any damage to our protective boot. Lock this on there as tight as possible. We've got that on there. Let's make our way to our mounting nut. Slide that out of there. Continuing in this same area along the bottom of the lower control arm, it's time to start dislodging the lower aspect of the front strut from the control arm. This is held in place with a 21mm headed bolt that makes its way through from the rear all the way through to the front, and along the front you're going to find a 24mm headed mounting nut. I'm just going to hold that mounting nut. Slide that off of there. Let's tap this out of here. Let's use a hammer and punch if necessary. A quick inspection of our mounting bolt and we'll set it aside. Continuing on from here, we're starting to focus along the top of the steering knuckle where it connects to your upper control arm. We're going to dislodge our upper ball joint mounting nut using a 21mm. It's a good idea to have a swivel socket for this. Watch out for any pinch points. Once you remove that mounting nut, a quick inspection, start it back on a couple threads. Now we'll be using a hammer, causing some light vibration along this area, attempting to separate this. Otherwise, if you did happen to have a joint separator, you could use that as well. Let's get some penetrant on this. we can remove that 21mm mounting nut. There's that. Now we can slowly start lowering this down. We're paying attention to where our axle comes out the backside here. Start sliding it right out the backside of the wheel bearing. Set that aside. Now we can carefully use a pry bar and separate the axle from its mounting point. Just going to come right underneath this area. We'll gently pry in between the two pieces. Should want to pop right out of there. Let's take hold of the axle. Now we can start sliding it down and out through this area. Just flex things as necessary. There it is, friend. With the axle out of position, the next thing you need to do is clean and inspect the mounting point, especially the seal. If it looks like it's torn or damaged, you have to go ahead and replace it. Just give it a quick wipe. If you happen to have any silicone paste, go ahead and apply a thin amount of that on here as a lubricant. Now it's time for the installation of our driver's side front axle. We'll make sure that we flex the front strut out of the way as necessary here. We'll bring this up and through and continue on aligning it to where it needs to be. Keep this nice and low. We're going to swing it up past here. You want to be extremely careful for both of your boots. You don't want to cause any damage to either of those. Now let's pay attention to the inboard aspect of the axle. We're going to have to slide it into position. Now as we slide this in, you're going to have to lightly start tapping it inward. After you feel as though it's bottomed out, take hold of the inboard side of the axle and try to pull it out. We want to ensure that the locking clip's properly secured in place. Assuming it is, let's make our way to the outboard side of the axle now. We'll gently flex this and slide it into position. Now we'll continue pressing this in. While we're pressing it in, we're swinging the upper portion of the steering knuckle into place so we can align it with the upper ball joint. There we are. Now we can see the axle shaft protruding through this area. Let's make our way to the upper ball joint now. For this, you're going to have to raise the steering knuckle while bringing the upper control arm and ball joint down. To help raise this up safely, we'll be using a jack to support this while we continue up along the top. Now as we get this in position, we're going to have to lower down that upper control arm. If you need to, you could carefully use a pry bar. Just be extremely careful for any pinch points, of course. Just going to make my way up along the top of that control arm. We'll make our way onto one of the control arm mounting bolts. Gently start prying this down just enough we can start on our mounting nut. Once you started it on, bottom it out. Torque it to 70 foot-pounds. To torque this to 70 foot-pounds, you're going to notice that the entire steering knuckle spins on you. It can only go so far. Now you can remove support from under your lower control arm. Continuing from here, it's time for the mounting bolt that goes through from the lower portion of the front strut through that lower control arm and then out through the front. Along the front of the front strut, we'll be using our 24mm mounting nut. At this point, you may have to raise or lower this control arm. I'll just be using a pry bar for this. We want to be extremely careful near our axle boot. You can flex this as necessary. Before you can tighten this lower mounting bolt, you need to have the suspension in original ride height position. You could, of course, put everything back together, install the wheel, And while you're on the ground, tighten this, or you can just apply pressure underneath the lower control arm, applying the same amount of pressure as if you were on the ground. Now we can snug it up. The torque for this is 173 foot-pounds. When tightening this, we'll be using our 21mm wrench for the bolt head and a 24mm socket for the mounting nut. We're going to make sure we torque the nut side of this. Just get my wrench on there. Remove your tools and the support from underneath your lower control arm. Now it's time for our front sway bar link. We're going to take the stud of that, slide it right on through the control arm. Once it's through, we'll be holding onto the stud with some locking pliers, just like the removal process. On the rear, we have our 18mm mounting nut. You may find you have to either raise or lower the suspension as necessary. You could also flex the sway bar if necessary using a pry bar. Now it's time for our 18mm nut. We'll go ahead and start this on, snug it up. The torque for this is 90 foot-pounds. Now it's time for the outer tie rod end. Let's get this in position here. Just slide it right up and through that knuckle. Start on your mounting nut, snug it up. The torque for this is 70 foot-pounds. Now it's time for your axle nut. It's always a good idea to have a brand new axle nut for the installation process. When installing your axle nut, never use an impact tool. You can only use hand tools. You don't want to cause any damage. Now, when tightening this by hand, you may find that this whole thing wants to spin on you. Now, if that's the case, go ahead and get this down closer to the ground. You can either have a second person holding the brake pedal for you, or use a pry bar diagonally down to the ground, holding this from rotating. As we bring this bar into position, you want to be extremely careful for all of your lug studs. You don't want to cause any damage to these, of course. The torque for this is 229 foot-pounds. Now we can remove our lug nut and our spacer. One last quick inspection in this area, and we can reinstall our wheel. Once you've started on the lug nuts, go ahead and snug them up. We'll get the wheel back on the ground and we'll torque each of these to 130 foot-pounds. With the wheel safely on the ground, we'll be torquing these to 130 in a crisscross manner. Torqued. Okay, friend, we showed you how to install your driver's side front axle. The next thing you need to do is go ahead and pump up the brake pedal. Make sure it's nice and firm. Take your vehicle for a road test, listening for funny noises, and get yourself a four-wheel alignment. Thanks for watching.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.